Today is July 16th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to start, as always, with the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. We are over a month and a half into Ukraine's long-awaited offensive, approaching 2 months now. And as you can see, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map, hardly any progress at all has been made by Ukrainian troops along the entire line of contact. In fact, we can see these red rifle icons. That indicates that in some areas, Russia is on the offensive. Now, these areas right here, this here, and this area right here, this is in the security zone, the space between Ukrainian and Russian defensive positions. This is the progress Ukraine is claiming they've made. Remember, their objective is to reach the Sea of Azov. They're not even up to the first line of defense, let alone have they taken any of these cities in between, let alone have they reached Melitopol or Crimea. That is another one of their stated objectives, or Mariupol for that matter. And in the east, even though it seemed like they were making an attempt to encircle and take Bakhmut, they have failed to do so far. And I want to remind people that the layered defensive positions in the east are actually between Bakhmut and Popasnia. They are not in or around Bakhmut. So even if Ukrainian forces did manage to take Bakhmut, a PR victory, it most certainly would be, they would still have to breach these echeloned defenses, reach Popasnia, and then have access to the rest of the Donbas region. And they have failed categorically to do any of this. And we've been listening to even the Western media, even Ukrainian leadership, military and political leadership, admit that the offensive is not going as planned, is going much slower than anticipated. We remember some of the Western articles about how important the first 24 to 48 hours would be for the offensive to break through Russian defenses, cause disarray amongst Russian ranks, break Russia's will to fight. This has obviously not happened. And more to the point, let's look at some of the losses. Now, of course, this is TASS, this is Russian state media. This is according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. So there's no way to confirm this one way or the other, but they are claiming that Ukraine has lost 26,000 troops, dead or injured. And then down here, they give a list of the vehicles, the hardware destroyed. They're talking about 21 warplanes, 5 helicopters, 1,244 tanks, and other armored vehicles, which means everything from infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, but also MRAPs, Humvees, other vehicles like that. They talk about 17 German-made Leopard tanks specifically, 5 AMX tanks. These were the wheeled light tanks provided by France, 12 US-made Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And since this was given, this tally given, we've seen more Bradleys, more Leopards destroyed in subsequent attempts to breach the security zone and reach the first of several Russian defensive positions. It also says there are 914 special automotive equipment, 2 air defense systems, 25 multiple launch rocket systems, and 403 field artillery cannons and mortars that have also been destroyed since the Ukrainian offensive began, I would say around June 4th. That's what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying, and we cannot confirm whether this is true or not, but we can look at the Western media itself. Western leaders, Ukrainian leaders, all admit that things are not going as planned. And if they're not going as planned, then obviously they're suffering greater losses than anticipated. They're obviously losing men and equipment. They're not making any progress in the process. And timing matters. There is a clock ticking, the amount of artillery ammunition on hand. They have always had a deficit in terms of artillery ammunition. They have switched from mainly Soviet-era 152 millimeter rounds to 155 millimeter rounds provided by NATO. But of course, NATO has a very small amount relative to Russia's stockpiles. They also have a very small production capability compared to Russia's current production capabilities. In terms of artillery rounds, they have been firing, Ukrainian forces have been firing before the offensive began, maybe up to 6,000 rounds per day. And at times, Russia is claimed to have been firing 10 times as much, 60,000 rounds per day. In a recent Washington Post interview with Ukrainian Commander General Valery Zaluzhny, he admitted that at times Russia has Ukraine outgunned 10-1. I've covered that before. And before the offensive, the United States and Europe dipped into their remaining stockpiles, and they surged a large amount of artillery rounds to Ukraine, specifically for the offensive. Once they go through that ammunition, there is no more on that scale to provide Ukraine. All they will have left is what they're able to produce month to month, which is not much, which is not even enough to sustain 6,000 rounds a day, let alone whatever it is that they're expending now in the middle of their offensive. So each day that goes by, Ukraine is firing artillery shells, but if they're not making progress on the battlefield toward whatever their objectives might be, those are that many rounds fewer they have to complete the offensive. So that is a clock that is ticking, and once they are out of artillery rounds, that is it for their offensive. This is exactly why the United States is sending these 155 millimeter cluster munitions. They are 155 millimeter. They fit into these howitzers that NATO has provided Ukraine, but instead of the high explosive shells that Ukraine has been using and needs to use, that they are the most effective shells they have available to them, they now have to use these cluster munitions because that's all they have on hand. And when these are used, they disperse smaller bomblets. It's a mix of anti-personnel and anti-vehicle bomblets, very similar to grenades and shape charges. They can destroy troops and lighter armed vehicles out in the open, but in terms of working on heavily fortified positions, not so much. They would want to use high explosive rounds. They are running out of high explosive rounds. This is even admitted. Even President Joe Biden, US President Joe Biden, admitted that this is being done because Ukraine is out of ammunition. The West is out of ammunition to continue providing Ukraine. With all of this in mind, we are hearing another news story making the rounds. We're hearing yet another Russian general being relieved of his position, complaining about the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the West seizing upon this for propaganda value. So let's take a look at this Business Insider article. A fired general's pleas from the front lines reveal Ukraine is bloodying Russian forces in a critical fight. Now, I looked up a translated transcript of these comments. It was a recording that was made in private that was then released without the general's knowledge. And somebody sat down and translated this and provided the transcript. And this is Medusa. It's a Western-funded anti-Russian propaganda outlet, and so they're going to translate it in the least flattering way. So this is not a pro-Russian translation. This is Medusa, is anti-Kremlin propaganda outlet, and he's obviously upset. There's a lot of things that he's saying about how frustrated he feels, but the key point is here. I pinpointed the main tragedy of today's warfare: the lack of counter-battery fire, the lack of artillery, reconnaissance stations, and the mass death and mutilation of all our brothers by enemy artillery. And if you have been following the offensive closely, you will know that the fighting is fierce, and Russia is also taking losses, and they're taking losses owed to Ukrainian artillery, but so is Ukraine. That is all he said. Additionally, he says further down, as many regiment commanders in the division today have said, the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces couldn't break through our lines. And then he's talking about how it was their senior commanders hitting them from behind and describing it as treachery. But what they're saying is that Ukraine cannot break through. So despite the damage they're inflicting with their artillery, they're not breaking through. And we can see that they're not breaking through. We can look at the pro-Ukrainian live map, and we can see that they're not breaking through Russian defenses. What is this? Going back to the Business Insider and this article, and there's many like it, this is a good representation of this Western narrative floating around. This is what the article says. Before he was sacked, the Russian general raised concerns about the dire situation his men are facing in a key sector of the front. After he was fired, he revealed publicly that Ukraine is bloodying his forces in an important fight, the artillery battle. This is not true. It was a recording he made privately that was released by somebody else. So already this is inaccurate, this report. In an audio message shared online, Major General Ivan Popov said he brought concerns about a lack of counter-battery combat, the absence of artillery reconnaissance stations, and the mass deaths and injuries of our brothers in artillery fire up to the highest levels of the Russian military. And just from that one sentence, the Western media is trying to extrapolate a narrative that portrays Ukraine as somehow winning along the line of contact in regards to artillery fire, which simply is not reflected in the reality on the ground. The reality on even the pro-Ukrainian live maps. The article continues. It says a key element of the counteroffensive in its early stages is the counter-battery fight, which involves trying to eliminate an enemy's indirect fire assets, such as mortars and artillery, that can shatter assaults on Russian positions. In this fight, Ukraine relies heavily on rocket artillery systems like the high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, or howitzers like the 155mm M777s. As Jack Watling, a Royal United Services Institute land warfare expert, assessed early on in the Ukrainian counteroffensive, there is an intense counter-battery duel being fought, with both sides trying to strike each other's logistics, command and control, reconnaissance, and artillery systems. These types of operations can be a challenge for an army if it advances beyond the reach of its available systems, still a possibility for Ukraine, or if it finds itself outgunned, a problem Kiev's forces have faced alongside ammunition concerns. General Valery Zaluzhny, the top officer in Ukraine's armed forces, said in a recent interview with the Washington Post that his forces are at times being outshot tenfold in the artillery battle. So the article is admitting that despite this one sentence in a released private recording of a Russian general, despite him saying that there are problems regarding the artillery duels along the line of contact, Russia is outgunning Ukraine. That is a fact that even Ukraine admits. It continues. It says, where the Ukrainians do have an advantage, as Kan Kasapoglu, a non-resident senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, notes, is in its modern artillery kill chain. The system is supported by counter-battery radars and spotter drones, tools suited to finding Russian assets, as well as better fire support systems, essentially better weapons that came from NATO nations' generous military assistance packages, he wrote in commentary this week. But here we go with the myth of NATO weapons being better. They obviously are not better. They are also not as numerous, nor is the ammunition that they're using. They're also talking about this modern artillery kill chain. They're talking about counter-battery radars and spotter drones, as if Russia doesn't have these exact same systems, but in vastly greater quantities. Then it continues. It says, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with AN/TPQ-36 radar systems designed to detect incoming mortar, rocket, and artillery fire and identify where it has been fired from, facilitating follow-on counter-battery radar operations. Counter-battery fire operations. They're talking about counter-battery radar systems, which both sides have. Ukraine had a number of these from Soviet-era equipment, and then they were destroyed. The West has been sending small amounts of counter-battery radar that they have. Those have been destroyed. Whatever they have left most surely is being used in the offensive and being concentrated on just a few places along the line of contact, whereas Russia needs to keep their systems spread out more evenly because they're not exactly sure where Ukraine is going to attack next. But I want to point something out here. There's this article from the Defense Post. It is from November last year. U.S. Army seeking lightweight countermortar radar for Ukraine. And there you see it. It's on top of a Humvee. And you could also mount it on the ground. And they're talking about these counter-battery radars that they have been sending Ukraine that now they need to manufacture because they have no more radar systems to send Ukraine from their existing inventories, they need to manufacture them. So this radar system needs to be manufactured. A number of other radar systems that the US had been transferring to Ukraine that they no longer have available to transfer to Ukraine need to be manufactured. This takes months to do, and Russia is removing them off the battlefield faster than the US can manufacture them. The Business Insider article continues. It says, Ukrainian armed forces are also equipped with HIMARS, firing guided multiple launch rockets systems, GMLRS, and M777 artillery systems that have proved particularly effective since their deliveries last year. Not really. Not really. And for all of the reasons that we've constantly talked about. Limits in terms of ammunition, limits in the number of launchers or guns that the US can provide Ukraine. And we have seen not only Russia find and destroy these weapon systems, but they have their own equivalent to all of these weapon systems. So I've talked about the Tornado S. That is the Russian equivalent of the HIMARS. Each launcher fires more rockets than HIMARS does. They fire for a longer range than HIMARS does. They obviously have a much larger number of artillery pieces of all kinds, towed and self-propelled. They also have a lot of long-range weapons that Ukraine does not have, like the Garan 2 or the Iskander missile complex, which is similar but more capable than the ATACMS Ukraine has been asking for but has yet to receive. Also, remember that Russia has a large number of cruise missiles that they are manufacturing, obviously, every single month and firing at targets all across Ukraine. So this idea that HIMARS and M777 somehow gave Ukraine an edge over Russia, this is another myth. The article continues, and although Ukraine has had to conserve ammo due to dwindling stockpiles of M155mm artillery shells, but both at home and among Western partners, including the US, which has provided millions of shells, the country is now receiving cluster munitions, dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, or DPICMS, do more damage across a larger area than standard unitary artillery shells by releasing bomblets or submunitions. That is not true. They create damage across a wider area, but they don't create more damage than a high explosive round. The high explosive round is able to create more damage wherever it hits than these bomblets can spread out over a wider area. That's why there are two different munitions. If it was capable of just as much destruction but over a wider area, there would be no need for high explosive rounds. Artillery is at the core of this conflict, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said last Friday, adding that Ukraine is firing thousands of rounds a day. With cluster munitions, it can do more damage while expending less ammunition, taking some of the pressure off Ukraine while making Russia's problems worse. Again, categorically untrue. They are sending these cluster munitions to Ukraine because they literally have nothing else to transfer to Ukraine. They are out of what Ukraine needs. They're sending Ukraine whatever they have, which are these dated cluster munitions. And this, again, was admitted by US President Joe Biden himself. Ukraine is running out of ammunition. That is what he said.
They're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, took the recommendation of the Defense Department to, not permanently, but to allow for, in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, to provide them with something that has a very low dud rate.
Finally, the Business Insider cites Forbes, and I'll put the link to Forbes, and there's also a Hudson Institute piece that is referenced in this Business Insider article. I'll put the links, both of those, in the video description below. It says, as a recent Forbes analysis citing open source intelligence reporting found, since the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, Russia has lost 4 artillery pieces for every one that Ukraine has lost, significantly eroding what was once an advantage in total available indirect firepower. But of course, this open source intelligence reporting is from Oryx. Oryx is not doing analysis of the conflict. They are performing war propaganda. If you have been following Oryx and believing anything that they say, you would believe that the Russian military has been utterly decimated and Ukraine has suffered only a fraction of the losses Russia has. And we can see on the ground right now, amid this offensive, a completely different reality that actually exists. If you were believing Oryx, you might have repeated or agreed with retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, who said at the beginning of the offensive that Russian defenses were brittle and that they would break under Ukrainian advances. And obviously they have not. It's exactly the opposite. As a matter of fact, no sooner did General David Petraeus call Russian defenses brittle, a Wall Street Journal article came out citing Ukrainian soldiers claiming that Russian defenses were like hitting a steel wall. So this Business Insider article is just one of many pushing this particular narrative. They're trying to claim that Ukraine is in the process of destroying Russian artillery, that this is just one phase of the offensive. They're going to destroy Russian artillery, then they're going to launch their offensive. But we can look back at the 1.5, almost 2 months now of fighting, and we can see that that is not what has happened. They already launched their offensive while also trying to do this counter battery artillery fire. They don't have enough ammunition to do both. They don't have enough ammunition to destroy all of Russia's artillery, which will never happen. They will never run out of artillery before Ukraine does. And then have enough artillery shells left to give cover to the armor as it moves forward. And don't forget, they have to clear these minefields also. So everything about this narrative is a fantasy. This is just the latest fantasy that they have indulged in to avoid facing the reality that the offensive is failing, and that overall this is a war of attrition that Ukraine cannot win through NATO-style maneuver warfare. That is not going to happen, and they do not have the capabilities to fight and win a war of attrition against Russia. And now the article concludes by saying counteroffensive operations are a challenge to execute even with sufficient air power and long-range strike capabilities, which Ukraine does not have. They admit that. The last thing they need is enemy artillery raining down on advancing forces, which is what has been happening. So despite this claim that Ukraine is clearing out Russian artillery, every time they advance, it's Russian artillery that stops the advance. It also says, but if Ukraine can support its maneuver forces with its artillery guns and exploit the nuances within the art of fires, Hinton said, he was the one writing for the Hudson Institute, it will provide a significant advantage as its forces undertake one of the more difficult military endeavors. And again, just look at the map. After 1.5, going on to 2 months of offensive operations, where is Ukraine? Does this narrative reflect the reality that we see unfolding on the ground in Ukraine? The answer is no. And we can look at what's going on in this offensive, where Ukraine has lost a quarter, even a third, and in some cases even half of certain types of equipment NATO has transferred to Ukraine ahead of this offensive. And I'm talking about main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, MRAPs, and the engineering vehicles that they need to use to clear these minefields. Here's another one. This is from the New York Times. At U.S. Army base in Germany, Ukrainian troops are striving to master the powerful M1 Abrams tank. There it is with rollers for clearing a minefield. The M1 Abrams is equivalent to the Leopard 2, especially the export version Ukraine is going to be getting. They talk about how the Ukrainians are only getting about 3 months of training versus the 6 months an entry-level tanker would get before going to their unit and training even further. We just watched these German Leopard 2 tanks destroyed on the battlefields. Ukraine will be getting even fewer of these M1 Abrams tanks to use. And we've already seen Leopard 2s and M1 Abrams on modern battlefields elsewhere in northern Syria. The Leopard 2 was destroyed in numbers by irregular forces there. And in Yemen, M1 Abrams operated by Saudi troops who had much more training, much more experience operating these vehicles. They were destroyed in Yemen by irregular forces who had far fewer resources and training and capabilities than the Russian troops these M1 Abrams will be going up against in Ukraine. So again, just another article from the Western media with this same war propaganda we heard ahead of the Leopard 2s going to Ukraine, and also the same propaganda we're hearing about these F-16s possibly being sent to Ukraine. And just to drive home the fact that this is indeed a war of attrition, that Russia is winning, and to illustrate the desperation that is sinking in across the West, let's take a look at this. This is in regards to Ukrainian air defense capabilities from the Drive. Taiwan's retired Hawk surface-to-air missiles headed to Ukraine. Report: Taiwan recently retired its Hawk surface-to-air missile systems, which the U.S. may be buying back and sending to Ukraine. So there's nothing certain about this, but we've already heard the U.S. talking about sending Hawk anti-aircraft missile systems to Ukraine. Now, this system was developed in the 1960s. The Phase 3 Hawk missiles that Taiwan decommissioned were last upgraded in the 1980s. So these are very old missile systems. This is what predated the Patriot air defense system. The U.S. does not have enough Patriot air defense systems or interceptors for them to fire to meet Ukraine's air defense needs. Also, they don't have enough IRIS-T or NASAMS between the US and the rest of Europe. So they're just finding anything at all that they can use. Now, this is a medium-range air defense system. If you had to compare it to something that's right now on the battlefield, you could compare it to, say, the Soviet-era Buk missile launcher. Only the Buk is more advanced, more mobile, more capable than the Hawk air defense system. Neither the Hawk nor the Buk system can defend against Russian warplanes dropping glide bombs. These glide bombs have a longer range than either the Hawk or the Buk missile system. They're dropping these glide bombs along the line of contact. The mobile air defense systems that Ukraine has left are incapable of targeting the aircraft dropping these glide bombs. So at best, what the Hawk air defense missile system is going to do is to delay the inevitable, that point in time where Ukraine's air defense systems are so degraded that Russian air power can operate anywhere over Ukraine with relative impunity. And that's if and when these Hawk missile systems show up on the battlefield, because there's another problem. They all need to be refurbished. And that's easier said than done. And to explain this, I want to use another example, the Stinger air defense system. This is a man-portable anti-aircraft missile. It's described in this article by Defense One. There is a photograph of a Ukrainian soldier carrying the Stinger missile system. And the title of the article is Raytheon calls in retirees to help restart Stinger missile production. This is actually a very good article that explains the reality of the problems the West has with military industrial output. So it says Raytheon has called in retired engineers to teach its employees how to build the Stinger missiles heavily used by Ukraine's military, using blueprints drawn up during the Carter administration. It's the latest example of a private company working to ramp up production of a now in-demand weapon that the Pentagon hasn't purchased in decades. Stinger's been out of production for 20 years, and all of a sudden, in the first 48 hours of the war, it's the star of the show, and everybody wants it. This is Wes Kremer, the president of RTX's Raytheon division. He said this during an interview last week at the Paris Air Show, though this article is from June 2023. The United States has sent nearly 2,000 of the heat-seeking missiles to Ukraine, which has used them to shoot down Russian aircraft. All of those missiles have come from U.S. military stockpiles, and the Biden administration said this week it will send even more Stingers to Ukraine. When the U.S. Army placed an order of 1,700 Stingers in May 2022, the Pentagon said the missiles wouldn't be delivered until 2026. Kramer said it would take about 30 months for Stingers to start rolling off the production line, largely because of the time it takes to set up the factory and train its employees. We're bringing back retired employees that are in their 70s to teach our new employees how to actually build a Stinger, Kramer said. We're pulling test equipment out of warehouses and blowing the spider webs off of them. On top of that, the electronics used in the missile are obsolete, said RTX CEO Greg Hayes. We're redesigning circuit cards and redesigning some of the componentry, Hayes told Defense One in a June 14th interview. That just takes a long time. While engineers these days often tout 3D printing and automation as a way to speed up the manufacturing process, that's not possible with the Stinger, because doing so would not only mean redesigning the weapon, but also undergoing a lengthy weapon certification process. You'd have to redesign the entire seeker in order to automate it, Kramer said. That means that they must be built the same way they were built 4 decades ago, including installing the missile's nose cone by hand. And if that's the story of the Stinger, what do you think the much older Hawk missile system will entail? A very similar process, a very lengthy and impractical process. But this is where the US and the rest of NATO are right now, struggling because of the inefficiencies of their military-industrial base. This all goes back to the state of the Western military-industrial capacity. It's the way the United States and its allies have organized and used their military over the last several decades. They've been fighting these very small wars. They've prioritized profit over purpose. They've maintained very small production lines specifically to maximize profit. And because they've done that, they're now entirely ill-prepared for a large-scale conflict like what's unfolding in Ukraine. And Russia did not do this. They inherited a massive military-industrial capacity from the Soviet Union. They maintained it, they modernized it, and in certain aspects, they've expanded it, which is why they are prepared for this conflict in Ukraine, and the collective West is not. And this is something that takes years and years to do, and these are years and years that Ukraine doesn't have. They do not have the time for the West to catch up with Russia's current state of military-industrial output. In this aspect, Ukraine's fate is sealed. And we remember older articles where they talked about how the US is never going to be able to produce enough artillery shells for Ukraine to match or exceed what Russia is firing. Their process of expanding their production will take until 2028, and even then, it will not be enough. I've talked about this at length. And they talked about how instead Ukraine needs to learn how to fight smarter. They have to fight using NATO-style maneuver warfare. Well, that's what they're doing in the middle of this offensive, and we can see how that's playing out. So they've tried expanding military-industrial output. That is impractical. They've tried NATO-style maneuver warfare. That is not working. What's left for them to do? And one final point. Here's yet another interview with Ukrainian Commander General Valery Zaluzhny. Washington Post. To defeat Russia, Ukraine's top commander pushes to fight on his terms. There he is again, standing behind this chair, July 14th, 2023. The article describes him as the man Ukrainians trust to keep them safe, and Western partners trust with billions in security assistance. Both expect him to recreate Ukraine's earlier underdog success on the battlefield. And of course, they're talking about the Kharkov offensive, which took place in a region where there were hardly any Russian troops present, and also the Kherson offensive, where Ukraine was losing multiple brigades in stagnant fighting until Russia decided to pull out, move to the other side of the Dnieper River, and left the city uninhabitable. The article goes on and says, but if it were up to Zaluzhny alone, this is not how he would get the job done. He would fight with air superiority. He would fire back at least as many shells as the Russians are firing at his troops, and he would have cruise missiles that could match Moscow's. Instead, modern fighter jets such as the US-made F-16 are not expected on the battlefield until next year. Ukraine's ammunition supply is constrained, with the Russians often shooting 3 times as much in a day, and General Zaluzhny in a previous interview said as many as 10 times as much in a day. He's obviously not getting any of this. He's not going to establish air superiority over Ukraine. That is impossible. Even if the collective West handed over every single F-16 in their inventories to Ukraine today, they would not be able to establish air superiority because they don't have the pilots capable of effectively using these warplanes. They don't have the maintenance crews capable of maintaining them, and they don't have the airports and the infrastructure required to operate them. This is completely unfeasible. It cannot happen. It will not happen. He's also not going to get more artillery ammunition because it physically does not exist. It doesn't exist, and it will not exist even in 2028 when the US finishes expanding its production. They still will not have enough artillery rounds produced per month to match Ukraine's current rates of fire that are being outmatched by the Russians. And cruise missiles. They've been given the Storm Shadow cruise missile. It has made no difference. They don't have enough of them. They're not able to fire enough of them at one single time to sufficiently overwhelm Russian air defense systems. And Russia itself has much longer range cruise missiles that are far more effective and far more numerous. This is a reoccurring theme here. The rest of this article is about how General Zaluzhny says he's going to strike Russia even without NATO approval, and he's going to use Ukrainian-made weapons to do it. Whatever Ukrainian-made weapons he has to do this with are going to be at least developed in cooperation with NATO, most likely in NATO territory, so that the workshops and the teams working on them cannot be targeted by Russian strikes inside Ukrainian territory. But again, they're not going to be able to make enough of these to make any difference. For every long-range strike weapon Ukraine is able to put together and launch at Russia, Russia is able to launch many times more at targets all across Ukraine. Don't forget that Russia has the best air defense in the world. This is even according to Western analysts, and they have proven this over and over by defeating the few long-range strikes Ukraine has launched into Russian territory, deep into Russian territory. So this is a lose-lose situation. Ukraine will not admit defeat, but they have no way of winning. Their NATO sponsors face the same problem. They cannot admit defeat, but they have no ability to win on the battlefield. All they can do is delay the inevitable, just like they did in Afghanistan, just like they are doing in Syria right now, what they're doing in Iraq, what they had been doing in Vietnam for years and years and years. They dragged it out for as long as possible, unable to change the fundamentals that from the very beginning determined the outcome of the war, not in their favor. And by extending this conflict further, trying to delay the inevitable, all they're doing is extending the amount of death and destruction that takes place within Ukrainian territory. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on YouTube, Telegram, Odyssey, Rumble, Twitter. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up on YouTube, feel free to skip it because it's not doing me any good. If you do want to help out, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping by sharing my work with others, thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching.